In February of 1889, a Union Pacific tunnel crew cutting a realignment bore through the Pequop Range east of Wells, Nevada, broke into rock that had shown no fracture and no warning of anything but more granite for the 70 feet still ahead of the heading. Progress on the bore had held steady for 6 weeks, roughly 4 feet a day. Ordinary advance for hard rock, cleared by hand drilling, and black powder in country, where the granite ran clean and predictable. The powder man that morning was a driller named Thomas Reyes, 11 years with the company, most of them spent on grading crews in Wyoming before he transferred west the previous spring for tunnel work in the Pequops. Reyes set his charge before dawn, cleared the heading, and waited out the blast from the muck pile 40 feet back with the rest of the crew. When the smoke thinned enough to walk forward, the rock face at the end of the drift was gone, not blasted apart the way granite fractures under powder, but opened, a doorway-shaped gap where solid stone had stood the night before, leading into a chamber the blast had only grazed. Inside that chamber, set into stone carrying no tool mark and no visible seam, was something that was not rock. Reyes called it a door, in his own words, later recorded by the crew's timekeeper, flat, standing without a frame, fitted into the granite as though the mountain had grown around it rather than been cut to hold it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Pequop Range rises out of the high desert of northeastern Nevada, a fault block mountain chain running roughly north to south between the Independence Valley and the Goshoot Valley. Granite and quartzite lifted along old normal faults and worn down since by wind and frost for longer than the mind comfortably holds. By the winter of 1889, the original transcontinental grade laid down 20 years earlier, Union Pacific working west from Wyoming and Utah, Central Pacific working east from California, had proven too steep and too curved for the freight tonnage the railroad now needed to move. Coal, ore, and cattle were crossing Nevada in volumes nobody had planned for in 1869, and the division engineers working out of Omaha had authorized a series of realignment cuts and short tunnels intended to shave grade percentage off the worst sections of the Humboldt division. The Pequot bore was one of 4 such projects contracted that winter. A straight shot of just under 2,000 feet meant to replace nearly 6 miles of switchback grade on the original line, cheaper in the long run than the fuel and time the switchbacks cost every train that climbed them. The rock through the range had been mapped on paper as a uniform granite intrusion, old, stable, and geologically unremarkable, the kind of formation railroad engineers of the period favored precisely because it held its shape without shoring and drilled clean. 2 exploratory borings drilled the previous autumn to confirm the tunnel's alignment had shown nothing unusual, solid rock the full depth of each hole, and nothing in the survey notes filed ahead of construction indicated a cavity of any kind anywhere along the planned route. Union Pacific in 1889 was a company still recovering its footing after more than a decade of financial turbulence. The original construction bonds from the 1860s had left the railroad carrying debt that outpaced its early revenue, and the company had passed through receivership and a series of ownership battles through the 1870s and 80s, including years under the direct financial influence of Jay Gould, before a new management team worked to stabilize operations and modernize the line's aging infrastructure. Realignment projects like the Pequot bore were part of that modernization effort, funded cautiously and scrutinized closely by a board of directors wary of cost overruns after years of exactly that kind of overrun nearly sinking the company in the previous decade. Every division superintendent in 1889 understood that an unexplained delay, especially one that could not be attributed to weather, equipment failure, or labor trouble, the ordinary and forgivable causes of lost time, invited exactly the kind of scrutiny from Omaha that careers did not survive. A 4-day stoppage with no plausible mundane explanation was not merely an operational problem. It was the kind of item that could appear in a board report and prompt questions nobody at the division level wanted to answer. This context does not prove that Halloran redirected the heading and sealed the chamber specifically to avoid that scrutiny. It does establish, with more certainty than the missing report itself allows, exactly the institutional pressure a resident engineer in his position would have felt the moment he understood that what Reyes and Whitcomb had found was not going to resolve itself quickly or explain itself in terms a superintendent could summarize in a single mundane line. The crew working the heading in February numbered 14 men under a foreman named Elias Whitcomb, a Cornishman who had worked hard rock since the age of 14, first in the tin mines of his home county, and then across 3 states of American railroad and mine construction after he emigrated in the 1870s. Whitcomb had seen voids in rock before, solution cavities in limestone country, old stopes left by earlier prospectors who had come and gone without filing a claim, the occasional lava tube in volcanic ground further west. What Reyes found on the morning of the 9th was none of those things, and Whitcomb said so plainly in an account he gave more than a decade later to a newspaperman in Elko, researching a retrospective on the old realignment projects, an account that survives because the paper printed it in full, and because a bound copy of that issue sits today in the Northeastern Nevada Museum archive in Elko, catalogued among a run of the paper's 1890s issues. Whitcomb described a chamber roughly 12 feet across, walls cut smooth in a way he said no blasting or hand tool of the period could produce, and at the far end, the door itself. He measured it by eye at about 7 feet high and 3 feet wide, set flush into the stone with no visible hinge, no handle, and no latch of any kind he recognized from 20 years of working iron and stone. Its surface carried a pattern of shallow grooves, not random scatter, but lines running parallel to one another that bent at regular intervals into what Whitcomb called, in his own phrase preserved by the newspaper's typesetting, corners that didn't belong to any shape he knew. He was careful, even given more than 10 years to embellish the memory, to describe only what he had seen with his own lamp and not to speculate beyond it. The geological puzzle the chamber presented was not lost on the men who found it, even without formal training in structural geology. Granite, of the kind that makes up the Pequop core, forms deep underground from slowly cooling magma, crystallizing over thousands of years into a dense interlocking rock mass that does not, under any process geologists of the period or since have documented, produce sealed voids on its own. Limestone dissolves along fractures and bedding planes to form caves over geologic time. Volcanic rock cools around trapped gas to form lava tubes. Granite does neither. A void in granite, absent later mining or quarrying, is not supposed to exist, and the 2 exploratory borings drilled the previous autumn specifically to rule out this kind of surprise had shown nothing but solid rock along the tunnel's planned center line. The chamber Reyes broke into sat roughly 8 feet off that center line, close enough that the borings should have grazed it if it had been there in any form detectable by a drill core, and far enough that whoever or whatever had made it, if it was made rather than grown, had positioned it with a precision that unsettled Whitcomb more than the door itself. He said as much in his later account, noting that a natural cavity large enough to miss 2 exploratory borings by pure chance was one thing, but a cavity with smooth-cut walls and a fitted door inside it, missed by the same margin, was harder to accept as accident. No geologist inspected the chamber before it was sealed. Union Pacific's engineering department did not, as a matter of course, retain geological consultants for realignment projects of this scale, relying instead on the resident engineer's own judgment and the exploratory boring program to flag anything requiring further study. Whether the chamber would have been flagged for genuine geological study had Halloran chosen to request it rather than order the heading redirected is a question the surviving record cannot answer, because that request, if it was ever made, exists nowhere in the correspondence that survives today. The crew did not touch the door that day. Standard practice on any anomalous find during railroad construction called for the heading to be halted and the resident engineer notified before work resumed, and Whitcomb followed that procedure to the letter. Work stopped at the Pequop bore for the first time in 6 weeks. A wire went out to the division engineering office at Wells, and within 2 days a resident engineer named Franklin Halloran arrived at the site to inspect the find in person. Halloran's presence in the historical record is not in question. Union Pacific's engineering department maintained a roster of resident and assistant engineers assigned to each division, and Halloran appears on that roster for the Humboldt division continuously through 1891, a document filed today with the company's surviving 19th-century personnel records held by the Union Pacific Railroad Museum in Council Bluffs. What is missing from every collection consulted for this account is any trace of what Halloran found or wrote once he reached the Pequop heading and stood where Whitcomb and Reyes had stood 2 days before him. Isolated anomalies like the Pequop chamber are not unique to that one drift in that one range. American hard rock construction through the second half of the 19th century, mine shafts, railroad tunnels, and irrigation adits driven through mountain after mountain from Nevada to Colorado to the Appalachians, produced a steady undercurrent of similar reports, a sealed cavity where the survey showed none, an object or a surface that the men on the working face could not account for, followed almost without exception by a quiet stoppage, a redirection of the heading, and a silence that settled over the crew within days. Most of these reports never left the mining camps and section houses where they were first told. A handful survive because a local newspaper printed them decades later as color for an anniversary piece, or because a family passed the story down until someone finally wrote it into a county history nobody outside the county ever read. The Comstock Lode in Virginia City produced its own version of this pattern in the 1870s, when miners driving adrift on one of the deep claims reported breaking into a smooth-walled cavity at depth that surviving company records describe only as an unproductive void, backfilled within days and never formally surveyed. The Cripple Creek district in Colorado carries a similar story from the 1890s, passed down through mining families rather than preserved in any company file, of a shaft crew that struck a chamber lined with material no assayer on site could identify, sealed by the mine's owners before word could spread far beyond the camp itself. Appalachian coal operators recorded stranger finds still, objects reportedly embedded in coal seams laid down hundreds of millions of years before anything resembling a human hand existed to make them, most dismissed at the time as concretions or simple misidentification, a handful preserved only because a mine inspector or a local newspaper editor thought them curious enough to write down before the memory faded. None of these accounts, the Pequop chamber included, amounts to proof of anything beyond the pattern itself, and the pattern is not evidence of coordination or of any single explanation. It is evidence of how 19th-century American industry handled the unexplained when the unexplained threatened to slow production or invite scrutiny from outside the company. Geologists were rarely called. Archaeologists, where the discipline existed at all in any organized form, were almost never consulted on discoveries made underground by working crews far from any university. Newspapers were not informed unless a stoppage lasted long enough to require a public explanation, and even then the explanation offered was almost always mundane: a bad seam of rock, a delay in supplies, nothing worth a follow-up. The institutions capable of investigating a find like the Pequop chamber simply were not built to receive word of it, and so word did not travel far, and the physical evidence itself went back into the mountain within days of being found. The pattern across these scattered accounts is remarkably consistent. Not a single dramatic cover-up, but the ordinary machinery of a large 19th-century company doing what large companies did with anything that threatened to slow a schedule or invite outside attention, filing it, redirecting around it, and letting the desert or the mountain close back over it. The Pequop chamber fits that pattern with unusual precision, down to the 4 days the timekeeper's log would soon record as idle without further explanation. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Railroad construction in the 1880s generated an enormous volume of paperwork, and Union Pacific's engineering practice required a written field report from any resident engineer inspecting a stoppage of work. filed with the division superintendent and forwarded in copy to the chief engineer's office in Omaha. The division superintendent's correspondence for the Humboldt division in early 1889 survives nearly complete in the company's archive, catalogued by month and cross-indexed by subject, and the record shows exactly what a working railroad generated that winter. Weather delays on the grade near Tuano, a powder shortage traced to a delayed shipment out of Ogden, a dispute over a grading subcontract close to Wells, a report on frozen water lines at a section house further east. What the correspondence does not show is any report from Halloran on the Pequop stoppage, though the index itself, the ledger a clerk kept listing every incoming and outgoing letter by date and subject, contains a single entry for the 9th of February that reads only, in the clerk's own hand, tunnel heading, Pequop, special report, followed by a routing notation and no corresponding document filed under that date anywhere in the collection today. The letter the clerk logged does not exist in the archive. It was either never filed as the index implies it should have been, misfiled beyond recovery in a collection otherwise remarkably well organized for its age, or removed after the fact by someone with access to both the file room and the reason to want it gone. What can be reconstructed of Halloran's 2 days at the site comes only from Whitcomb's later account and from the practical requirements of the job itself. A resident engineer inspecting an anomalous find of this kind would ordinarily have measured the chamber, examined the door as closely as the crew already had, and made some determination about whether the tunnel alignment could proceed through it, around it, or required a formal halt pending instruction from Omaha. Whitcomb's account describes Halloran spending the better part of a full day inside the chamber alone, an unusual amount of time for what should have been a routine inspection, before emerging and giving the order that the heading would be redirected and the opening sealed. Whitcomb was not present for whatever Halloran did during those hours, and no other member of the crew has left any surviving account of the inspection beyond confirming that it happened and that Halloran's manner afterwards struck them as changed, quieter than before, in Whitcomb's word. The work stoppage lasted 4 days, an unusually long pause for a project already behind its winter schedule, and the timekeeper's daily log, which survives complete for the entire construction season, records the crew as idle for those 4 days without explanation beyond the single word "special" written in the margin beside each date. On the 5th day, the log resumes its normal entries: blasting, mucking, timbering, and the tunnel heading had been redirected. Rather than continuing straight through the chamber Reyes had broken into, the crew drove a new heading angled several degrees to the side, a costly and unusual deviation for a railroad tunnel where straight alignment mattered for both grade and sightline down the finished bore, and one the timekeeper's log does not explain beyond noting a change in bearing authorized by the resident engineer. The original heading, the one that opened directly into the chamber and the door, was sealed, not backfilled casually as debris from later blasting might accumulate over time, but closed deliberately, according to Whitcomb's later account, with a timber bulkhead built specifically to wall off the opening before the crew resumed work on the deviated line. No photograph of the chamber or the door was taken, or if one was taken, none has surfaced in any collection catalogued to date. Photography on railroad construction sites in 1889 was not rare. Union Pacific's engineering department employed staff photographers to document bridge work, cuts, and major tunnels for both internal record-keeping and company publicity, and photographs from the same construction season, showing other sections of the Pequop realignment, survive in the collection now held by the Nebraska State Historical Society. There is no photograph from the 9th of February, or from any of the days immediately following it. There is a single entry in the division photographer's own assignment logbook, also preserved, listing his work by date, and the entry for that week reads Pequop heading, per instruction, held, with no image number assigned, and no corresponding negative anywhere in the collection. Whatever the photographer was told to hold, it was never released for filing, and no later entry in his logbook ever revisits the assignment. Thomas Reyes did not leave Nevada immediately after the stoppage. He continued working the Pequop project through the completion of the deviated heading that spring, and his name appears on the crew payroll continuously through June of 1889. What changed, according to the same Elko newspaper account that preserved Whitcomb's testimony, was that Reyes stopped talking about what he had found. Whitcomb recalled that in the days immediately after the 9th, before Halloran arrived, Reyes had described the chamber and the door freely to the rest of the crew, repeating details of the grooved pattern and the way his lamplight had moved across the surface without catching a reflection the way it should have on worked stone or polished metal. After Halloran's visit and the redirection of the heading, Reyes went quiet on the subject entirely, and when other crew members asked him about it directly in the following weeks, he told them there was nothing more to say and that the matter was closed. Whitcomb attributed this to a private conversation between Reyes and the resident engineer, though he admitted in his account that he had not witnessed that conversation himself and could not confirm it had taken place at all. What is documented in the payroll ledger that survives alongside the timekeeper's log is that Reyes's wage increased by 50 cents a day beginning the week after the stoppage, a raise the ledger attributes simply to reclassification. Driller advanced to lead driller without further comment, an advancement Whitcomb's account describes as unusual given that Reyes had not been in line for the position by seniority and that a more senior man on the same crew was passed over for it without explanation. Reyes left railroad work entirely in 1893, according to a brief item in a Wells newspaper noting his departure to take up ranching in southern Idaho, and no further record of him has surfaced in any archive consulted for this account. No obituary, no later interview, nothing beyond that single line announcing where he had gone. Franklin Halloran's career with Union Pacific continued for 2 more years after the Pequop incident, before he resigned from the company in the autumn of 1891, a resignation the personnel roster records without stated cause, unremarkable on its own, since engineers of the period moved frequently between companies chasing better positions, and there is no direct evidence tying his departure to the Pequop stoppage beyond the timing itself. He does not appear to have discussed the incident publicly, in print, or in any interview, at any point before his death, which a Union Pacific Railroad Museum biographical file places in 1914 in Sacramento, California, of causes the file does not specify. The missing special report, if it was ever written and filed as the correspondence clerk's index entry implies it was, has not surfaced in the company archive, in any state historical society collection consulted for this account, or in any private collection known to researchers who have worked on the Pequop realignment project since. What remains of the incident, beyond Whitcomb's testimony given more than a decade after the fact, is a 4-day gap in an otherwise continuous work log, a change in tunnel bearing that cost the company additional time and expense without any documented engineering justification, a photographer's assignment held without a corresponding image ever filed, and a correspondence index entry pointing to a document that no longer exists anywhere researchers have been able to locate. The Pequop Tunnel itself was completed in April of 1889 and carried Union Pacific traffic for several decades before the realignment it served was superseded by later grade improvements in the 1920s, at which point the original bore was abandoned in place, its portals left standing, but its interior no longer maintained or inspected on any regular schedule by anyone. The tunnel does not appear on current Union Pacific operating maps. It sits today on land administered in part by the Bureau of Land Management, within a stretch of the Pequop Range that sees little traffic beyond ranching access roads and the occasional hiker following the old grade on foot for its own history rather than any destination. The sealed heading Whitcomb described, the timber bulkhead built to close off the chamber and the door behind it, was never reopened during the tunnel's active decades so far as any surviving maintenance record indicates, and when the tunnel itself was finally abandoned, no effort was made to re-examine what lay behind that bulkhead before the portals were left to the desert and the slow work of frost and wind. A structural survey conducted by a mining engineering firm in 1967, hired by a private party investigating the old bore's potential for storage use, noted in its written report that the tunnel's western third showed evidence of an old side passage collapsed or deliberately filled, running perpendicular to the main heading, a detail the surveyors recorded without further comment because it fell outside the scope of their assignment and because the fallen material made further investigation impractical without excavation equipment the survey crew did not have on site that day. The private party that commissioned the 1967 survey was, according to the surviving contract on file with the engineering firm, a regional cold storage operator exploring whether the abandoned bore's constant underground temperature could be adapted for commercial use, a common enough proposal for old railroad tunnels throughout the American West during that period, and one that ultimately went nowhere for the Pequop bore once the surveyors flagged the collapsed side passage and the additional excavation cost it implied. The project was shelved. The tunnel's portals were fenced by the Bureau of Land Management in the 1980s, as part of a broader effort to secure abandoned mine and tunnel openings across the district, and no further engineering interest in the site has surfaced in any public record since. A field visit by a Bureau of Land Management abandoned minelands inventory crew in the early 2000s, documented in a brief internal report obtained for this account, notes the tunnel's condition as stable, but does not mention the side passage at all, which suggests either that the 1967 finding was never passed along to the later inventory team, or that the collapsed material has since settled enough to obscure it from a surface inspection conducted without excavation equipment. The tunnel today sits behind a livestock gate rather than any locked barrier, accessible to anyone willing to make the drive out along the old grade road and walk the last stretch on foot, though nothing about its exterior marks it as anything other than one more abandoned railroad bore among the dozens scattered across rural Nevada. That 1967 report is the last documented reference to the side passage in any record available to this account, filed and, as far as anyone has been able to determine, never followed up. What sits behind it, whether the chamber Reyes described still exists in any recoverable form after more than a century, whether the door remains where Whitcomb's account placed it or was removed by someone before the bulkhead ever went up, is a question no survey since has attempted to answer. The Pequop Range holds its geology the way it has for longer than any human record, granite intrusion rising out of desert valley on either side, indifferent to the 16 months a railroad crew spent driving a tunnel through one small section of it in 1889. What that crew found in the second week of February, and what a resident engineer decided to do about it in the 2 days that followed, exists now only in a foreman's testimony given more than a decade late, a timekeeper's 4 blank days, a photographer's held assignment, and a filing clerk's index entry for a report that was never kept where anyone since has been able to find it. The bulkhead Whitcomb described still stands, by every account available, somewhere behind rock and timber that a century of frost has had ample time to shift, and no agency with jurisdiction over that stretch of the Pequop Range has listed reopening it among any plan on record. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.